Help is on the way. My name is Mustafa Indanusa, and today I'm going to talk to you about some of the help that is coming to landlords and to tenants alike. Well, it's mostly going to be to landlords because they're the ones who are going to benefit, but it's also going to be able to benefit tenants because some of the headache that you've been experiencing because of the arrears that have been accruing, hopefully this new program is going to relieve a lot of that headache that a lot of tenants have been suffering from. So recently, Governor Cuomo signed a bill that is being called the COVID-19 Emergency Rent Assistance Program. It's actually part of a much larger bill, but this particular portion is the COVID-19 Emergency Rent Assistance Program. This is a little bit different from the one that I spoke about in the past. One of the differences is that this is an application that both the landlord and the tenant can apply for. It's not just the tenant like the old one, which is already expired. Hopefully there's a lot of money here, and based on the application, at least some of the parameters that I've seen already, that this will be something that applies to a lot more people than the prior program. So what I want to talk to you about today is a few of the salient aspects of this particular program. Again, my name is Mustafa Indanusa. I'm an attorney at Davis Indanusa, Ikhlas & Salim. I've been practicing landlord-tenant litigation since 2001. Today is April 23rd, 2021, and I always try to say the dates in some of these videos because sometimes the way the law has been changing, the way the law changed very quickly during the COVID-19 pandemic, it was almost like weekly things were changing. But I believe that this particular video, there shouldn't be too much of a change between now and maybe several months to come. So what are some of the differences? What are some of the important aspects of this particular law? One, it covers a period from March 13, 2020 until about March of 2021. So it's a 12-month period that's covered. If you have arrears that are owed during that time period, that's going to be covered in this particular bill. You may be eligible to apply for arrears from March 13 to 2020 to March 13, 2021 to be paid for by the state if you fit some of the other sort of criteria for this particular application. So it only covers arrears during that time period. Another aspect of this particular bill is what I mentioned before, that the landlord and the tenant can apply for this particular program. The program has not gone live yet. I'm going to talk about that at the end, but either the landlord or the tenant can fill out the application. Another aspect is that the landlord, if the landlord applies or the tenant applies, whatever amount of money that you get, that money is going to be considered to satisfy all the debt, all the arrears that's owed in that particular time period, which is that 12-month period that I talked about. That 12-month period might be extended for another 3 months, but we don't know yet. But right now, what we do know is it's going to be for that 12-month period. So if the landlord, let's say, applies and the rent arrears that's owed is $20,000, the landlord gets granted $18,000, the landlord accepts the $18,000, that's it, final, it's done. The landlord doesn't get to ask for the balance of the $2,000. Once we accept the $18,000, that account is cleared, the rents are satisfied, all those arrears for that particular time period is satisfied. Another aspect is if the landlord accepts the money, then for the next 1 year, the landlord is not allowed to commence an action against the tenant simply because the tenant doesn't have a lease. Also, the rent is frozen for a whole year from the time that the landlord accepts the grant, whatever money is granted to the landlord. So what that means, sort of put it in context, is, let's say, for example, the landlord applies, $20,000 is owed. Landlord gets $18,000. The rent arrears is, the rent for the particular apartment is $1,800 a month. Once the landlord gets the $18,000, that account, as I mentioned, is clear. Everything is paid in full. The $1,800 a month that the tenant is paying, that continues to be the rent for 1 year. That rent is frozen for a whole year. And for the next year, the landlord cannot bring an action against the tenant simply because the tenant doesn't have a lease. Now, the landlord, of course, can bring an action against the tenant if the tenant is not paying ongoing rent, but you can't bring an action against the tenant simply because the tenant doesn't have a lease. That's also frozen. But if for some reason the landlord happens to commence a case against the tenant within that 1 year period, the case is going to be stayed anyway, especially if there's a determination to be made. If a landlord commences a case and the tenant applies for this particular program and the determination has not been made, that case is going to be stayed until a determination is made as to how much grant that landlord is going to get. So in terms of qualification, what do you need to be able to qualify? You need to be able to demonstrate that you are a person that suffered financially due to the COVID-19 outbreak. You also need to be able to demonstrate that an individual in the household was eligible for unemployment benefits. You have to also demonstrate that you are as a consequence of this particular situation the person is in threat of being homeless. And then there are also other sort of financial requirements that you have to be able to demonstrate in order to qualify for this particular program. Now, there's going to be preference given to people who are victims of domestic violence, basically, people who may have to get out of a particular situation. There's going to be preference given to people that live in places that have been impacted more by COVID-19 than other places. And there's also going to be preference given to people who are already engaged in litigation regarding rent arrears that may be due for that particular time period in question, which is the 12 months from March 13, 2021 until about March 13th or thereabout, March 13, 2020 until March 13th, 2021. Final two things about this particular program is that it's not live yet. And what I mean by that is that there's no application that you can submit right now. But part of the law is that the state has to provide an application so the people who may be eligible will be able to complete an application probably online. And I'm sure if it's not available online, there's going to have different programs, just like they did with the other rent assistance program, where people can go into an office and be helped to fill out the application. And the final point about this is it's only available for residential tenants. It's not available for commercial. Hopefully in the future, there might be something that will be rolled out for commercial tenants. Right now, this is a program that's only available for residential tenants. So to just quickly go over, March 13, 2020, 12 months, that's the time period it's going to cover. Tenant and the landlord can apply for it. Once the landlord applies for it, if the landlord, one thing I think I may have forgotten to mention, if the landlord is granted money and the landlord does not accept the money, the tenant can use that refusal to accept the money as a defense. So, for example, landlord applies for $20,000 for the rent arrears. Landlord gets $18,000. Landlord refuses because it's not the entire amount. Then the landlord decides, I'm going to sue the tenant for the total $20,000. In court, as a defense, according to this particular law, the tenant can say, hey, look, the landlord was offered $18,000, the landlord refused. The landlord has basically waived the $18,000. So that's another aspect. That's a very important thing I think I kind of forgot in the beginning of the video. But landlord accepts the money. If the landlord refuses, the landlord waives that money. If the landlord accepts, the landlord cannot sue the tenant for not having a lease for a whole period of 1 year. Landlord accepts the money, the rent is frozen for 1 year from the time that the landlord accepts the money. At least that's the way I'm reading it right now. And then finally, there are some financial parts of the application that you have to be able to meet, and preferences are going to be given to certain people who have been most impacted by the COVID-19. If you're watching this video on YouTube, make sure you like us, make sure you subscribe, so that when there are other new updates on this particular law, we'll be able to disseminate that and you'll be the first to know about it. Take care, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye.